Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink program. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. Coming up, we leaf through a new cookbook dedicated to the cuisine of the Japanese island of Hokkaido.
Very unique food culture, even in a country where there's unique food culture everywhere. And I learned about the indigenous Ainu food and, of course, the seafood as well, which is sort of the best in Japan, I would say, maybe.
Also on the program, we learn all about the art of food styling with chef Ben Slater.
Everything has to work with everything else. Everything has to justify its place on the plate. Otherwise, it just shouldn't be there.
Plus, our in-house wine expert crowns her wine of the month. All that here on The Menu on Monocle Radio. All too often, we tend to refer to cuisines by just mentioning a nationality, but every country has agricultural and gastronomic differences that can and should be celebrated in hyper-specific regional dishes. In Japan, the northernmost island of Hokkaido is shaped by the produce that this fertile land, surrounded by cold seas, can yield, anything from creamy dairy to exceptional salmon, sea urchin and squid. Author Tim Anderson has dedicated decades of his life to studying and chronicling the food of Japan. He found the cuisine of Hokkaido particularly enticing given the parallels with his own upbringing in Chile, Wisconsin. His latest book, Hokkaido, Recipes from the Seas, Fields and Farmlands of Northern Japan, traces many distinct cities and villages to showcase their most representative recipes for people to replicate at home. But most of all, this book is a love letter to this island, the country at large and its inexhaustible idiosyncrasies. Tim joined me in the studio to tell me more. I started by asking him where his love for the nation began and why he chose to focus on this region in particular.
In a way, it's simple. It's this place I visited a long time ago for the first time in 2005 when I was in Japan on a research grant to study local food, specifically noodles. And I wound up studying local food museums and focused some of my research at the Sapporo Beer Museum, which is really like just a big advertisement for Sapporo beer, basically. But,
as these places often are.
Yeah. But there was something about Hokkaido on that trip. Well, not something about it. I know exactly what it was. But it reminded me of Wisconsin, where I'm from, in terms of just the feel of it. And, of course, the food, because it has this history of Western-style agriculture there, which has given it things that are quite famous, like milk products, butter, cheese, ice cream, things like that. Beer, of course. And, of course, Milwaukee, which is the nearest big city to where I grew up, is the brew city. We're famous for beer and cheese as well. And things like potatoes and corn and pork and sausage. And it just gave me this feeling of being like a home away from home. And then, of course, I learned more about it, and I went there again and learned about how there's a lot more to it than that. It's a really complex, kind of interesting, very unique food culture, even in a country where there's unique food culture everywhere. And I learned about the indigenous Ainu food and, of course, the seafood as well, which is sort of the best in Japan, I would say, maybe. That's a very contentious thing to say, but...
Yeah, and quite a claim for someone like you who's probably given it a good old thought.
But it is so good, and the more I learned about it, the more interesting it became. And so it was a dream project for me, because I never lived there, only traveled there briefly, so it was a dream project to go back and try to dig deep and learn as much as I could, and to celebrate it. It's a place that I love. Like I said, it feels kind of like a home away from home, but on the other hand, it is obviously very different from Wisconsin or from London in many ways. And it's beautiful. It's just one of the most gorgeous places, not just in Japan, but that I've been to ever. Lake Kusharo, which is this lake among a series of lakes in the sort of central eastern part of the island. It was so stunning when I visited. I just sort of had to take a moment and almost pinch myself because it was so beautiful and felt almost unreal.
This is, in theory, a cookbook, but I feel like it reads like so much more than a cookbook.
Thank you.
Do you feel like that was your aim when you were writing it? Did you want for it to be kind of used? Or I can read a bit more of a kind of the academic reverence and the food historian's eye in it. How did you approach collecting the information? Because every single dish has some really, really pointed information in terms of some relevance, some historical factoid. There's a lot of work that's gone into this.
Thank you for saying that. Because I did want it to be something you could pick up and learn from. And I did write it. Kurt Vonnegut, I read this quote from him a while ago. He said you should write for an audience of one. And the sort of implication is that you should write for yourself. So I wrote the book that I wanted to read, basically, because I wanted to understand Hokkaido a bit more in depth and really get under the hood of the dishes and the foods in general there. And there's things that I wish I had covered, and there was a lot that got cut out. The manuscript was about 25% longer than it was. The thing about cookbooks is that the recipes are sort of the meat. That's what people buy them for. So there is a little bit of a conflict there in terms of what I want to say and what the book is supposed to be for, which is, of course, cooking. And I hope people do use it for that because the dishes are delicious. But yeah, there's also, I should say, like a personal side to it. The question of why Hokkaido comes up even to me in my head. And so I wanted to kind of add my own personal experiences there. Not too much. I want it to be about Hokkaido, but and it's a bigger question for me, actually. People always ask, why Japan? Why Japan generally? And that's a big question. And I usually can only give a short answer. So in this one, I'm able to go a little bit deeper and be a little bit more reflective on that side as well.
How does Hokkaido's cuisine fit within the other regional cuisines of Japan? There's a lot there. Historically, lots of stratification, colonialism, complications, but also the sheer kind of amazingness of the produce.
Yeah, I almost don't know where to start. I think that the first thing to say for people to understand about Hokkaido is that it wasn't part of Japan until really quite recently in Japanese history. It was annexed in 1869, 1 year after the Meiji Restoration. Before that, there was a Japanese presence in Hokkaido. There were clans that were controlling trade and had outposts there, but it was only officially part of Japan from then, which is partly why it's so different. So there's three sort of streams of food in Hokkaido. There is the indigenous food from the Ainu and a few other ethnic groups that were there before. And that is its own whole other thing, which is covered a little bit in the book. But we have some recipes contributed by Hiroaki Kon, who's a chef based in Sapporo. He's an Ainu chef who has a restaurant there and also hosts a lot of Ainu cooking and cultural events. So it's a real kind of honor to have his contributions there. And that food it's very different from what people might expect from Japanese food. The seasoning's very different. Traditionally, they don't use sort of Japanese koji-based seasonings like miso, mirin, or soy sauce, the things we expect from Japanese food. Their seasonings are based on salt, usually kombu, and oil or animal fat or fish fat. Traditionally, those are sort of the core seasonings in Ainu food. It's different now because obviously they've had a long history of dispossession and discrimination. And also a lot of the sort of crops and foods that were used in Ainu food pre-Meiji have been either eradicated or endangered, basically. So it's changed a lot. And of course, there's a lot of what you might call fusion, although that's a tricky term, but basically incorporating flavors and ingredients, not just from Japanese food, but actually from around the world. So, for example, Kon-san, his cooking background he is in Italian food. He trained in Italy, had a restaurant in Osaka, so he incorporates that into Ainu food and vice versa. So there's Ainu food, and again, a huge topic, and it's something that people, I hope, will do their own research on because this is just one small glimpse of it. And then, of course, there is the food brought in by the Meiji government, and that was modeled on America, mainly, the U.S., but also Middle Europe. And that's where you get the famous cheese and butter and lamb. And a lot of these things also, which is interesting, is that the foods themselves are actually byproducts of getting materials for the military. So pork turns up a lot in Hokkaido food. It wasn't really eaten, though, until they wound up with a surplus from making leather for army boots and jackets and things like that. Same goes for lamb. One of the most famous Japanese Hokkaido dishes is Genghis Khan, which is a barbecued lamb dish. They were raising them for wool, and then the government basically said, well, we've got all this lamb. Everybody should try to eat it as well. Because at that time, there was also a huge push to sort of get the country eating more meat, because there were nutritional deficiencies all over the country, especially in terms of protein. So they just thought it's a win-win, basically. And then there's the seafood and what you might call the Japanese washoku influence, which has been there in a small way since before Meiji, but obviously came in a big way after that. And you had Japanese settlers coming and the Japanese military. And all these things sort of weave together or don't. Like they remain quite distinctive in a lot of ways. There is some Ainu influence in Japanese food in Hokkaido and vice versa. The kombu is a big one. Kombu, a lot of historians think, was basically introduced to Japanese food by the Ainu. So that's a massive sort of overlap there. And also just in terms of the ingredients that are used, the produce and the seafood and the wild animals as well. Venison is quite big in Hokkaido in both Ainu and Japanese cooking. So yeah, it stands apart, I think, quite distinctly from the rest of Japan. It's obviously linked. The last thing I'll say is ramen is an interesting one because ramen is really big in Hokkaido. And I think a lot of people, if you know the word Sapporo, most people will know the beer, and then they might know the ramen, the miso ramen, often with butter and corn on top. And even the ramen, which seems like this thing that doesn't seem very connected to the land and the history, it just feels like kind of a dish that can be made anywhere. Even that, if you sort of look at it and the reasons why there's so much good ramen in Hokkaido, that comes from the history and the agriculture as well. The wheat used to make the noodles, the soybeans used to make the miso, obviously the butter and the corn on top, but also because there's this history of trade with China directly from Hokkaido, which brought the whole format over, basically. So everything has these interesting histories and all these interconnections behind them.
The book is wonderful to me because it reads like a travelogue of yours as well. The chapters, which are divided by kind of size of dish, roughly, are also interspersed with these vignettes of the places that you visit. And many of them are wonderful. All of them are wonderful. But I particularly like Asahikawa. This slightly unloved place.
Yeah.
And in it, you say something that's really beautiful. And if you don't mind, I'll read out, which is... To be honest, I found little to do there in between bowls of ramen. But then again, I don't know what to do in between bowls of ramen, no matter where I am, which is actually so comforting and a beautiful thing to say. But I suppose my question is, how much real kind of micro-regionality did you find during these travels as well? Because every single place has such a distinct identity. It has its own mascot, its own specialty, etc. So how deep and micro can you go with the specificity of these dishes?
Yeah, that's a great question. You could go very deep. Yeah, there is obviously, there's sort of Hokkaido-wide dishes, and there's things that are grown and eaten all over the prefecture. But then there are also things that are very specific. Ramen is a good example. So Hakodate-style ramen is an interesting example of something that almost feels like it's frozen in time. We can't know what ramen was like when it was first brought over to Hakodate or to Japan, or rather what proto-ramen was like when it was brought over by the Chinese. But there's something about it that feels very, very sort of untouched from how it might have been originally. And even the restaurants that serve it hold on to a little bit of a Chinese identity in terms of their names and the look of the bowls and everything like that. They've got old school Chinese iconography like dragons and clouds and things like that. And then there's other things that are less about sort of the people who introduce them, but more about what is grown or caught in particular areas. So one dish that's not in the book, and this is a frustrating thing about a lot of Japanese cookbooks, but this one in particular, is that a lot of local specialties really rely on the produce from that area. So it makes no sense, or it's very difficult to put a recipe for it in a book. For example, uni, sea urchin, if you want to say to people, make an unidon, like, sea urchin rice bowl, you can't just say, go procure the finest, freshest sea urchin you can and crack them open and scoop out their gonads and put it on rice. It just doesn't make any sense. But there's a dish from Wakanai, the northernmost point in Japan, called tako shabu, which is shabu-shabu made from octopus. And the octopuses that are caught there are huge. They're absolutely enormous. I didn't see a whole specimen, but apparently what they do is they freeze the legs and then sort of slice them on a deli slicer into these very, very thin sheets, because otherwise it's just too tough and chewy to cook. And then you take them, these delicate thin sheets of octopus, and give them the shabu-shabu treatment, dipping them in dashi, eating them with ponzu or sesame dressing. And it's delicious, but it's kind of like you can only get it in Wakana. You can't really recreate it.
That was Tim Anderson speaking to me at Midori House. The way that we come to discover restaurant these days is so visual. Newspapers and magazines have always ran reviews on new openings, but social media has opened up a whole new lens on adventurous dishes and what they look like. The services of food stylists are in high demand, and Chef Ben Slater is one of the best in the business. His style blends the rigour of London's Michelin star kitchens with a scientific approach and creative flair. Of course, his plates don't just look good, he also has an experimental understanding of flavour which adds substance to aesthetics. In this conversation with George Ruskin, Ben delves into his journey from traditional chef to innovative food developer and stylist, sharing the moments that shaped his approach to food, from his first oyster to mastering the art of Thai flavour balance.
I guess flavour's always been like a huge part of my life. I was really lucky to start in a Michelin star kitchen, worked in a couple of Michelin star kitchens, then kind of moved to a private members club cooking jam roly-poly for Michael Heseltine or whatever, and then kind of moved to an oyster shack, which was really good fun. It was like a double-decker bus, like quite rock starry, I thought. And then just kind of moved out from there, but pretty much I was a chef for ages, and I'm still kind of working in food every day now, so I can't complain.
Were there any key moments or mentors that helped shape where you are today in any of these restaurants or roles that you were in?
It was more moments in food. My first oyster. For some reason, I remember my first best end of lamb. My first gooseberry. Like, these are all like pivotal moments that I remember. Every time I think about tannic sharpness, every time I taste that, I think about my first gooseberry. Every time I taste some kind of like sort of like salinity, I often think about my first oyster. Every time I think about a balance of sour and sweet, I think of being in Thailand and eating like, you know, fish sauce kind of blended with lime and sugar in it, and it all being so perfect. How one kind of dish can be so complete and can be so balanced on a tongue. So I guess it's less about mentors and more about moments in food for me.
I want to get some tricks of the trade and secrets for food styling from you, if I may, because I always find it absolutely fascinating how you make items of food look so delicious and dishes so visually appealing. What are some key elements that you adopt on a shoot?
Tricks of a trade. I tend to always have a brush with some oil on hand, just to paint over, because it picks up the light in a really nice way. I think props play a huge part in food styling. In fact, it's its own thing. It's prop styling. What did we do the other day? We boiled some ham hock and potato, and it was a bit like a kind of pot au feu. Absolutely delicious, stunning, not a looker. And then we put it on a beautiful vintage platter with lots of kind of farming scenes kind of lovingly painted into it. And it just looked absolutely gorgeous. So often it's about choosing the right size plates and the right coloured plates and the right backgrounds to make something that is delicious but potentially unappealing looking into something that looks kind of rustic and delicious and like your mum might have made had she been a slightly better chef. I think that's always the aim, to make something look totally achievable but very aspirational at the same time.
What's your creative process when you're developing a new recipe with that in mind? How do you find that balance between creativity and practicality for home cooks?
Whenever I approach a recipe, I approach it a bit like a puzzle. So it's almost like a Sudoku. Everything has to work with everything else. Everything has to justify its place on the plate. Otherwise, it just shouldn't be there. I'll start thinking about an ingredient. I won't start thinking about a process. I won't start thinking about what I want the dish to finish up as. And I'll think, how can I make this courgette the most delicious courgette it can possibly be? And I think to myself, courgettes need colour. The Maillard reaction is the caramelization of sugars on a piece of meat or a vegetable or whatever. And I think, how am I going to get that? And I think, okay, cool. I'll stick that in the oven with some oil and have a think about where I'm going to go next. And then I think, okay, so I've got something watery, I've got something vegetable, I need something starchy, I need something filling. And I think, orzo's quite nice, pretty popular right now as well. I tell you what, when the courgette's crispy and brown, I'll tip the orzo over. And while I'm here, I actually know that if you pour in 5 times the amount of water to orzo into the tray and put it in the oven, it will probably do quite nice things. And then you start to think about the fact you haven't really got any acid in the dish because you've got kind of watery courgette. It's also kind of minerally, and you've got orzo and it's starchy. So you need something acidic to cut through it all. And then you think about the fact that you chopped the ends off the courgette before you started, and actually they taste really nice. And then you realise you've also got some carrot tops in the fridge and a couple of herbs here and there, and you kind of make a kind of vegetal kind of salsa verde out of everything you have left over. And then your mind kind of turns to texture. You've got soft courgette, you've got slippery dressing, you've got soft starchy orzo, but no crunch. But you do have some sourdough that's going pretty hard and disgusting. You blitz it up, fry it with some oil, maybe a bit of garlic, because there's not much fragrance in the dish yet. And then when you serve it all together, it all kind of makes sense. All of these kind of parts of the puzzle have kind of come together in a loving way that balances texture and flavour and smell. And really, really importantly, from a home cook's perspective, you have a beautiful dish flow. While the courgettes are in the oven, you're thinking about where to go next. You're pouring your orzo and water into the tray, set it, forget it. You can focus on your textures and your acids. And by the time the orzo is cooked, after 15, 20 minutes, you've got a dish. I think when doing this Sudoku, and then you've got your separate puzzle of how someone's actually going to cook it at home, the Sudoku needs to work in a flow. So by the time the longest thing that takes to cook is done, you should have all your accompaniments done as well. And it's a puzzle I get really excited about.
What areas of cooking are you eager to start exploring?
I started doing fermentation, I guess, when everyone started doing fermentation. But that lacto fermentation and that sort of stuff kind of isn't enough anymore. So I've kind of taken lead from Silo in Hackney, where they kind of harness koji, which is like an inoculated rice grain, to give proteins umami and to amp up flavour in ways that just seemed impossible before. So I just spent the weekend making a fermentation chamber where I can kind of very meticulously control the humidity and temperature of an environment, so I can kind of grow koji and take my ferments to that next level.
And what does a fermentation chamber look like, if I can ask such a question?
My fermentation chamber looks like a bomb strapped to a fridge. So I bought a fridge, I drilled into it, I put different sensors and different temperature and humidity controllers, and put like a baby's humidifier in the bottom and a weird radiator thing that normally heats up greenhouses. It's very guerrilla, but yeah, it's going to work, I think, provided I can put up with the noise in my living room.
What are some of your store cupboard essentials?
Anchovies, huge. I've got about 4 tins of anchovies. Jarred beans, just like everyone else at the moment. Good sesame oil. I don't think people do enough good sesame oil. I bought mine from Kmart in New Malden, which is like the kind of Korean epicenter in London. It's just the best thing ever. And then I move into like kind of textures and starches. When I talk about textures, I talk about things like nuts and seeds. And then when I talk about starches, I'm talking like, I always have polenta in, I always have semolina in, I always have flour in. You can form the foundation of any good dish with 6 or 7 starches, so long as you always have them in. And you can form texture with 5 or 6 seeds, nuts, or kind of crispy bits if you have them in. And then I guess we kind of moved to the freezer. So frise en place, which is something we used to say in restaurants, was a play on mise en place. It makes absolutely no sense in French, but I've got loads in the freezer. So every time I get Parmesan and I have some left over, I'll blitz that up and save the rind to put in soups. I make a lot of stock, I freeze that. I wilt down wild garlic every year, just like everyone else in London. Pack it into little balls, which I then put into soups in the winter to make me feel a little bit more optimistic about spring. And then, yeah, just lots and lots and lots of frozen dim sum, because it's my secret weapon if I'm feeling a little bit down.
George Ruskin speaking to Chef Ben Slater. This is The Menu. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Sana Jumani.
London-based cheese seller Neal's Yard Dairy has been dealt a blow by fraudsters who stole more than €368,000 worth of artisanal cheddar. The scammers posed as wholesale distributors for a major French retailer to acquire over 950 cheese wheels, collectively amounting to 22 tons. The owner of one of the suppliers affected said the scam was sophisticated and the cheese could have been taken to Russia or the Middle East. The cost of making the Korean specialty kimchi has risen by 20% this year due to a 60% surge in the price of Napa cabbage and radishes. The soar in prices of these key ingredients is attributed to climate change and fewer areas of land available to harvest the vegetables. According to a study conducted by the Korea Price Research Center, it costs over 419,000 won, or €280 on average for a family of 4 to buy all the ingredients from a traditional market to make kimchi, with the cost even higher at supermarkets. And finally, British Airways is facing backlash for its decision to stop serving 3-course dinners in its business class cabin on flights departing after 9 p.m. The airline has axed starters from the meal and instead will offer a reduced selection of main courses and desserts, citing passengers eating at the airport lounge or wanting to sleep on the flight as reasons for the move. Longtime BA flyers are outraged by the decision, with some criticizing these alleged cost-cutting measures as a new low. Those are the week's food and drink headlines. Now, back to Kiara.
Thanks, Sana. You're listening to The Menu. And finally, we've just passed the end of October, so we're joined by Monocle's sub-editor and in-house wine expert Chloé Lake for her pick of Wine of the Month. This week, we're heading to Spain, to Mallorca specifically, for 12 volts from 4 kilo. Chloé, your appearance in this studio actually does remind me of the relentless onward march of time, because it feels like you were only here and another month has gone by, but it's a good relentless march if it does bring us to taste some delicious wines. So welcome.
Thank you. That was a very philosophical way to start, but yeah, I agree.
It's autumn, you know. I'm getting a little bit existential.
Time is flying.
You are bringing us somewhere really sunny and in some respects not very autumnal with your pick this month. Where are we going?
I am. We're going to Mallorca today, which is very exciting. Maybe not a super autumnal destination, but autumnal in flavors, which we'll see later. So very exciting. We're actually starting with what's called 12 volts today, and it's from a winery called 4 kilos. And the name itself is actually very interesting. So 4 kilos represents the initial investment that the people who founded the winery made, which was like 4 million pesetas at the time, which I think is about 20,000 in today's kind of euro standard. A modest investment and kind of demonstrating that good wine doesn't need to be super expensive. So.
And it worked out well for them.
It has, yeah. It has.
Talk to me about Mallorcan wine. Where does it sit with respect to the rest of Spanish wine? You know, I'm very passionate about islands, and so any wine that comes from an island, yeah. I'm immediately intrigued. But is there any specific characteristic to the Balearics and their wine production?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, it's a very hot place. The whole of Spain is very warm. But because of that, you kind of have later ripening grapes. They need to adapt to the heat. You get a lot more maybe fruit forwardness from this wine and a little bit more of, I guess, a fuller body as well, because getting so much heat, which really concentrates that flavor and that ripeness. I think in terms of Spain, it's definitely up and coming. This winery was founded in 2006, but I think it's now really just seeing its just desserts. So hopefully it'll kind of continue on that upwards trajectory and we'll see more from Mallorca.
So a red, which feels quite Spanish, I suppose. Obviously, the country makes all sorts of different wines, but it's the Spanish reds that really sing to my heart. Can you tell us a bit about the grape itself? You know, we know of like a number of great names of Spanish grapes. Well, where does this one sit?
This is super interesting, which is why I picked it, because it's actually grapes that are indigenous to Mallorca. So you really don't find them anywhere else. So 60% of this wine is made from Cayet and Foganus. Cayet, as I said, it's really hot there, so it's a late ripening variety, which means it retains a lot of its acidity, but also is able to kind of achieve ripeness a bit later. It's known for its softer tannins, its kind of sweeter flavor, and yeah, it's a really great, kind of interesting grape, I think. And then the other one, Foganu, was actually the most planted grape on the island back in the day, kind of the 19th century, later 20th century. And it was at the time when vineyards in France in particular were being attacked by phylloxera, which was this like super invasive worm that just decided to eat up all of the European varieties. So Mallorca really benefited from that, actually. And it was able to produce and export a lot of wine to its neighboring countries, but it's kind of not really known about that much. So yeah, I'm excited to taste this. And an interesting thing I'll just add about phylloxera is that nowadays most European wines are grown from American roots, and then what's planted on top of that is the European varietal. So they eventually got really to the root of the problem, quite literally, because the American roots are resistant to the worms. They have this sap that kind of closes up the grapes if they try and attack it. And then, yeah, that leaves the rest of the vine to be European. So it's all very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, once you get into the kind of nuts and bolts of the agricultural side of production. Once you get to speak to the winemakers about what phylloxera did in Europe.
Yeah.
It genuinely changed the landscape
It really
completely, and
did.
certain regions that had historical wine productions were completely wiped out and then are kind of being almost only rediscovered now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Majorca's, really shining, and yeah, it's great to see. So,
Well, you did give us a bit of a cue earlier when you were like, I can't wait to taste it. And I feel like we should honour your sentiment
absolutely.
by putting
Let's
it in the
go.
glass and seeing what happens.
Let's. Let's. Cheers. I went straight into taste there. Sorry, guys.
Like a true sommelier.
Yeah, no sniffing from me, just straight in.
But what are you saying? I think this is a very solid specimen from you.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. It's briefly aged in oak, so it has a very kind of slight smokiness to it, but not super perceptible. Also very smooth, I think. What's called long chain tannins. So they basically attach to each other and create this kind of nice, smooth finish, as opposed to that claggy feeling you can sometimes get in your mouth. And I'd say kind of like ripe forest fruits from this. Are you getting that?
It's very intense on the nose, actually.
It is,
It really
yeah.
has a lot of fullness in the nose. But as
Yeah.
you say, it doesn't have that difficult mouthfeel that you get sometimes with wine that smells like this. So
Yeah.
I'm appreciative because I think it feels like it would be very easily drinkable in quantities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think nice for autumn too. Something like, I don't know, a roasted chicken dish or maybe some game lamb could be super nice with this.
So do you tend to go heavier and heavier as the season kind of gets colder? Because
think
last
so.
time we had a bit of a kind of a more of
Yeah.
a light drinking red, and are we going to get heavier and
Exactly.
heavier as the months go by?
I think that could be a plan, but actually next month we're not going to be going red. I have a different plan in store for us, so you'll have to stay tuned, guys.
Well, looking forward to next month's installment, but we're not quite done with this wine yet. So cheers,
Absolutely.
Chloe,
Cheers.
to
Thank
pouring
you.
this absolute delight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's at midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show Food Neighborhoods for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This program was produced by Monica Lillis, and our sound engineers were Flynn Simons, Elliot Greenfield and Mariella Bevan. Thanks for listening, and until next week.